here in the Valley of Elah. I have a drone behind me. It sounds like a bee. Valley of Elah is where David and Goliath fought. If you look over to my left, or the western side would have been where the Philistines were. The eastern side where the Israelis were. Down here in the valley, of course, where David fought Goliath. Now this little rocky bed here is probably not the exact spot. This is where the water flows today. I don't know where it flowed 3,000 years ago. But of course, David came down here. Let's read the story of how he came to be here and why he picked up some stones. I mentioned to you earlier that the stones he picked up were not little smooth stones. They were big stones. They were about the size of an orange that could do some damage. Now, let's read the story here in Scripture here. And I'm reading from 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we start out with a conversation between David and his brother, Eliab. Now, Eliab is his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David and said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption. There must be evil in your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David says, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away with him towards another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again before him. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul. Saul's the king. And he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him," referring to Goliath. "Your servant will go fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight for him. You're but a youth. He's been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion, or when there came a bear, he took a lamb out of the flock. I went after him, and I smote him and delivered it out of his mouth." He took the lamb right out of his mouth. "And if it arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and I smote him and killed him. Your servant has killed lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, seeing that he has defiled the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor and put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David girded on his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, but he was not used to them. And David said to Saul, "I can't go in these things, for I'm not used to them." And so David put them off. Then he took a staff in his hand, and he chose 5 stones from the brook. That's where we're standing right now. And put them in his shepherd's bag for his sling in his hand. And he drew near the Philistine. And then the Philistine came on and drew near to David, and with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He was but a youth. He was ruddy and comely in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come at me with a sword and with a spear and a javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. And I will give your dead body to the host of the Philistines. This day the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel." What a challenge. "And all the assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hand." Reminding you here, while David's going to use the stone, it's not about the stone, is it? It's all about God fighting the battle. That's what he's saying here. We sing that song, "The battle belongs to the Lord." Verse 48, "And when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to him, David ran quickly towards the line to meet the Philistine, and he put his hand in the bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in David's hand. So then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He took out his sword and drew it out of the sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath. That's over on the coast there, the Philistine cities. And the gates of Ekron, another Philistine city, so that the wounded of the Philistines fell on the way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the Israelites came back from chasing the Philistines, and then they plundered the camp. Last verse. Then David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put the armor in his tent. Now I want to stop for a moment because most people miss that very last verse. David's a young man. He's not king of Israel. In fact, he'd just come from watching Dad's sheep. Even his brother disdained him. Why aren't you watching those few steeds? But David kills Goliath, he cuts off his head, and he goes to Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem is not controlled by the Israelites. You remember David later, went to Jerusalem, and his general Joab helped to capture Jerusalem. So this is years and years later. David takes the head, the skull of Goliath, and he plants it on a stake outside Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was controlled by the Jebusites at this time. David, perhaps as a prophet by this time, he'd certainly been anointed by Samuel, but he goes 30 miles away to a city that is not his, and he plants his head, the skull, on a stake outside Jerusalem. There's an important reason for that, because ever after, that place became known as the place of the skull. In Hebrew, it was called Golgotha. They're the first type, the first symbol of the enemy of God. The greatest enemy of God is not a Philistine, it is not Goliath, it is sin. And 1,000 years later, we have Jesus on that stake, on that cross, just outside Jerusalem, where he wins the final victory over sin.
Amen.
And it starts right here. It starts right here. And so, my question to you as I end today, and to our folks at Laguna Niguel as well, are you allowing the victory of Jesus to be yours? He's already fought the battle. Every victory he was won. He was tempted in all points without sin, Scripture says. But are you allowing the victory of Jesus to be yours? You're in the first place that commemorates that. Say goodbye to our folks in Laguna Niguel.
Shalom. Shalom. Shalom.
Thank you.